It's U of L Today on 93.9 The Ville. Here's your host, Mark Hebert.
And welcome to U of L Today with Mark Hebert on 93.9 The Ville. So glad you're joining us today for some good news about the University of Louisville. On this show, we talk about great research, great people, great students, those things going on at the University of Louisville that you should be proud of if you're a U of L supporter or a U of L alumni. So first, we got a little bit of good news before we get to our guest. A little bit of good news about U of L. U of L was named a cool school by the Sierra Club this week for the 8th straight year. U of L landed in the top 100 at number 43, jumping almost 30 spots from last year. The cool school rankings from the Sierra Club include data about each university's energy use, sustainability, food, and education, among other things. So congratulations to the folks at U of L who handle our sustainability initiatives at the University of Louisville. All right, coming up a little bit later in the show, why do people like heroin so much? What is it about heroin that's made it the number one health and safety crisis in Louisville and across the U.S.? We'll talk to an expert from U of L. But first, the University of Louisville has dropped anchor in Louisville's West End, running programs out of an office on West Muhammad Ali, in addition to continuing all of our programming through the Signature Partnership. Monica Wendell is with the School of Public Health and Information Systems at U of L. She's here to talk about one of the new programs that's been launched by U of L in the West End called the Youth Violence Prevention Research Center. That's a mouthful, Wendell. Monica?
It is. We typically just say YVPRC.
YVPRC? A simple acronym.
Simple acronym.
Rolls right off the tongue.
Right.
All right. Well, tell us a little bit about what, first off, is happening in the West End of Louisville and what programs U of L has taken to the West End.
So we were funded by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention this time last year for a 5-year project targeting reduction of youth violence in the West End. And we targeted the West End particularly because they see so many more disparities when it comes to things like poverty, opportunities for education, employment, having a family member incarcerated, and all of those things are risk factors for violence. So our idea when we started was really to get a bunch of people together who were coming from different disciplines and different areas of expertise and say, what do we know about violence and what do we know that seems to work either in targeting risk factors or in preventing violence itself. And a lot of what we heard was around what young people described as a lack of options. And
Nothing to do?
Well, not so much nothing to do, but more of what's expected of them or what they feel is expected of them in the community. And so if you put yourself in the position of a young person living in the West End, what they see is that a lot of their peers don't graduate high school. Their peers that are, quote unquote, doing well or have a lot of money are selling drugs.
Mm-hmm.
You're not tough unless you're strapped.
Strapped meaning?
Carrying a weapon.
Okay.
And making people fear you. That's how you get respect. And in talking with young people as well as adults, we heard this very kind of disturbing tension that young people live in, which is in certain situations where they experience somebody calling
them a name or something?
Well, calling their character into question, calling their family into question, insulting them in some way, showing them disrespect.
Mm-hmm.
The expectation socially is for them to respond with violence.
Mm-hmm. Part of the culture.
That's part of the culture.
So how do you change that? So what's U of L doing to try and change that?
Well, the other piece of the tension is what happens if they don't.
Okay.
And this is really where we're trying to get at those norms, because what happens if they don't is they might get beat up anyway. And if not, then they may be ostracized by the people who are calling their,
All right,
their
you're a
family
wimp,
members. Yeah, and that's not the word they use.
Well, I know it's not the word they use, but I'm going to use that word because we're on the radio.
Good word, absolutely. And so we started looking at why those norms exist. And so looking in the science, like I said, we drew from a lot of different areas of expertise. And what we learned is that young people are frustrated because and particularly young African American students, because they're not learning their history. And so they have this frustration because they feel like things aren't fair, but they can't really necessarily articulate it. They don't know where it's coming from. But then they see that, more African American students are disciplined at school. More African American students are dropping out of school. More African American students are being incarcerated for the same crimes that a white student is not incarcerated for. And so they see the injustice that happens, but they're not totally sure where it's coming from. And the reality is, and what we hear from them is that they're not being taught their true history at school. Okay. They're being taught a version of history that does not include them.
It's white history.
It's white history, and it's, Black history then gets relegated to a few people during February.
All right. So again, what's U of L? What are you guys working on to do? We're talking with Monica Wendell, who's with the University of Louisville and working in the West End on a youth violence initiative. So again, what's U of L hoping to do to turn that around?
So what we're doing, we actually have hired some young people from the neighborhood, ranging in age from 16 to 24. And they come to us with a lot of different kind of backgrounds and experiences, and they're helping us put together a social media campaign. It'll be a 3-year campaign. It'll launch next spring, and it will use various kinds of mass and social media. So I promise you that when it launches, you won't be able to miss it. You'll know exactly what it is. But there will be things like billboards and bus shelter signs and signs on the TARC buses, but then there will also be a lot of social media, because that's how kids communicate with each other, and those are the kinds of things that they pay attention to. And what the campaign is aiming to do then is to bring in aspects of Black history, pre-colonial and post-colonial, that they may not know about, that actually show kids, hey, you come from kings and queens. You come from people that have made amazing contributions to humanity. And maybe you're not being taught that at school, but that doesn't make it less true. And you do have options. And you don't have to be who you think society is telling you have to be. So let's look at what resources and supports are out there. So part of it is teaching history, and part of it is linking that history to positive racial identity. What the science tells us from various disciplines is that those are things that are linked to acts of violence and norms of violence. Okay. And so that's what we're aiming to do.
Okay. And that starts in the spring, right?
So we are busily working on campaign development. We actually have some elements of the first kind of wave of the campaign that our campaign design committee has seen. But yes, it will launch. You should start seeing some teasers in January, and the full launch should be sometime around May.
All right. We're talking with Monica Wendell from the University of Louisville. Let's try and wrap up this discussion about the youth violence portion of this program that you're working on. So are you trying to just give kids, particularly African-American kids, some assurance that if they stay out of trouble, they can be the next Frederick Douglass or the next Oprah Winfrey or something like that? Or what's behind the message?
That's a good question. We believe that successful African-American kids shouldn't be the exception. They are the exception now, particularly coming out of urban areas because of all of the factors stacked against them. But that doesn't have to be their story. Mm-hmm. And so really we're talking about changing the narrative, and that's actually the title of our project, mm-hmm. I guess, is changing the narrative, because it's not about what the story has been, but really looking at young people and giving voice to their experience and the fact that they have power and that they can use their voice to advocate for change. So really, we are training young people to be advocates and activists, and then they'll go back out into their own peer networks and be able to say, did you know this? And have you heard this? And what you're being told isn't the whole truth. So let me share with you what I know. And hopefully changing that narrative from within the group of young people, not to say, oh, if you stay out of trouble, but to say, yes, the odds are kind of stacked against you in society, and that was created on purpose, but it doesn't have to be that way. And here is how you can use your voice to advocate for change.
Okay. All right. Very good. Well, one of the other things that you've got a sort of a second job over here. There was this study on child obesity that you worked on. Tell us a little bit about that study and what you found.
Sure. So that study actually took place before I got to Louisville. I was at Texas A&M University prior to coming here in 2014. And we did an NIH-funded study looking at kind of the effect of converting classrooms in elementary schools to be stand biased versus seated biased. So if you think about your normal second grade classroom, you walk in and there's desks and chairs, and kids come in, they take their seat, and they start school. We outfitted 12 classrooms with desks that were tall.
That you stand up at.
That you can stand up at.
Okay.
But they also had stools that were the height, the right height to sit at the desk. So they could sit at their own discretion. But what we know is that kids aren't wired to sit and be still. If you have kids, you know that they're not wired to sit and be still. But we train them to do that. We condition them to do that because in an educational setting, it can be really distracting. If kids are all moving around, you think 25 kids in a classroom, if they're all moving around, how do you get anything done? But that's not their natural state. And so if we give them the opportunity to stand where they can actually relieve some of that kinetic energy without being a distraction, they're not running around the room, they're just standing at a desk and they can fidget with their feet, then they actually are able to pay attention better, focus better, learn better, which is important for the schools, but it's also increasing passive calorie burn. So if you think about the childhood obesity epidemic in this country, how do we target kids for where they spend the majority of their time in a way that doesn't take away from instructional time? And so this was our thinking behind trying this out. And what we found was that we did see effects. And it's hard when you're talking about kids because kids are supposed to be growing. They're supposed to be gaining weight because they're growing. And so what you're not looking at is necessarily a decrease in weight, but a decrease in BMI percentile.
BMI meaning body mass index.
Right, so that as they grow, they are staying more within the normal range and less in the overweight to obese range, and we did see that.
So you found you had obviously a control group, I'm assuming, where kids all seated like we were in school, seated at their desk, and they had another group over here that had the desk that they could stand at.
Right.
And you found what? What was the difference in body mass index between the kids who were standing and the kids who were sitting all day?
Oh, you're asking me a question that I don't remember the number off the top
all
of my head. I want to say it was like a.
I'm looking at my cheat sheet.
I think
here.
it's a
5.2%.
5.2%. I think it was like 0.8 pounds or 0.8 BMI points. But essentially,
they were in better shape. The
kids
standing
who
up.
stood, which they weren't forced to stand, but the kids who had the opportunity to stand actually had a slower increase in BMI as they grew than the kids that were in a traditional seated classroom.
And of course, a lot of folks would say, well, can schools afford the expense of getting the stand-up desk? And I don't even know if they're more or less, but they've got, I'm sure, old desks that they've had for years and years and years. Can they afford to go out and buy several classrooms full of stand-up desks?
Right, and that's always the challenge. They are comparable in price, but most schools that already have a whole school full of furniture don't have the money to just go and totally change furniture. And so what we really would like to advocate for is new schools that are being built or schools that are being renovated where they have furniture in their renovation budget to consider just wholesale trading out the old seated desks for stand-bias desks.
Okay. Monica Wendell, thank you very much for being on the program. Appreciate it. Good luck. Dr. Martin Hecker is with ULP, which is the University of Louisville Physicians, and he's also the research director in the Department of Emergency Medicine at the University of Louisville. I talked to him about the heroin addiction that has struck so many in our community and others. Here's a look at that interview. And we're here with Dr. Martin Hecker from the University of Louisville Physicians, and he also works in the emergency room at University of Louisville Hospital. And I'm assuming you have been seeing quite a few of these heroin overdoses. So tell me what you've been seeing in the emergency room over the last few weeks.
Well, we're seeing a lot in the last few weeks, really even over the last several years with taking the pills off the street. People are turning to heroin, but the last few weeks have gotten a lot worse. I think it relates to new drugs coming in town. Basically, you're seeing these stronger drugs they're cutting the heroin with. And so we're seeing overdoses that are like maybe more severe and then having to give more of the reversal agent to these patients. So it's really, we've seen an uptick lately.
So what do you see? Heroin addict walks into the emergency room and they need treatment. What do you see in that person?
Well, they don't walk in usually. They're brought in on a gurney. I'll give you an example of what I saw about an hour ago.
Okay.
People frantically running toward our exit door because a family member dropped a patient off out in the parking lot. And so we kind of rush out. I hear they're doing CPR. The patient's not breathing. He's blue. So we roll him into our trauma resuscitation room. He is blue, not breathing, looks lifeless. We stop CPR, check his pulse, and he has a pulse. And then we get him hooked up to the monitor, start bagging him, and then we pull out the reversal drug, the antidote.
What's it called again?
Naloxone.
Naloxone, okay.
Or Narcan, also called, brand name. So we gave him actually one dose is all it took, and about a minute later, maybe 30 seconds later, he woke up, looked around, what the heck's going on,
Just like that.
Alive. Yeah, it's pretty. If you haven't seen it, it looks like a miracle almost. I mean, it's just. They go from lifeless, dead, maybe the family will sometimes do CPR, and then the next minute they're talking. They're often somewhat mad at us because sometimes we can throw them into a withdrawal state with that medication because it blocks all the receptors.
Wow. And you've been seeing more of these cases, you said, over the past several years, not just in the last few weeks, right?
Exactly. With heroin specifically, in 2010, they reformulated OxyContin so you couldn't crush it anymore.
Right.
Then in 2012, we passed our House Bill 1 to take pills off the streets to make it harder to prescribe them. And so ever since about that, anywhere between 2010 and 12 is where this trend kind of began, and we just see heroin skyrocketing in the ER.
All right, we're talking with Dr. Martin Hecker from the University of Louisville Physicians, and he also works in the emergency room at UofL Hospital, and he's been seeing heroin overdose patients. We also heard some anecdotal stories, at least, of patients actually standing out in the parking lot of UofL Hospital outside the emergency room and shooting up with heroin so they knew they could get quick treatment. Is that true?
Yeah, we were actually just talking about that before I came because this patient was dropped off and other people in this family were told that that's the safest place to shoot up because if you do overdose, we're right there for you. We have a lot of patients who shoot up in the bathroom, either of the ER or of the hospital. We had a mother whose baby was in the hospital who walked down from the third floor, went to the bathroom in the lobby, shot up, overdosed, was pulled into our trauma room, resuscitated her, and it's so sad, and that's just, we're seeing so much more of it now.
And what do you tell them in the emergency room? Mark Hebert walks in, clearly overdosed on heroin. You give me the antidote, the naloxone or whatever it's called, and you give that to me, and then do you lecture me about how bad it is and tell me to get off this stuff and get help, or what do you do as a doctor?
I usually try to maintain 100% compassion. I know how terrible it is. Heroin and the opioids just rule these people's lives. Their brains hardly work anymore. They'll sell their kids, they'll sell their mother, rob from people. So I know that they don't want to be in this situation. So I try to come from a position of compassion and say, this, I know this sucks. Have you been clean before? Like kind of strike up a conversation. How long were you, are you staying in place? Are you in the healing place? Are you getting treatment? And just appeal to them because I'm sure, a lot of what they hear is negativity. They're being judged. They are, being, yelled at or whatever, maybe by their family. So I do try to appeal to that aspect of the situation and see if I can get them some help.
And you said some of these patients, some of these heroin overdoses, these patients get mad at you for what? Taking them out of their high, I guess?
Yes. So depending on the dose you use of that antidote, a small dose can sometimes make them start breathing without fully waking them up. A larger dose will wake them up completely, cause them to have withdrawal. They'll begin vomiting, and then they'll get very mad at us. And anywhere in that spectrum, they might ask us to leave. Either we killed their high or we put them in a full withdrawal.
Right.
At that point, they just want to get out of the ER to get high again.
Right. That's just crazy. And what did they tell you when they come in? Did they try and hide it and say, "Oh, I don't know, I hit my head," or "I don't know what happened"?
Sure.
Do you get some of those excuses?
Definitely. We have some that obviously get reversed with naloxone, obviously go from lifeless to awake, and then completely deny it. No, there's no heroin, and then the police will kind of walk over, "Oh, we found this on them. They're carrying a bag of heroin on them." So it's funny how even at that point when we know so much about them, they'll try to say, "No, I wasn't doing that."
Why this drug and why heroin now from your experience and from what you're hearing from these addicts? Wow, is it just cheap? Is it easy to find? Because a couple of years ago we would have been talking about meth as being the really bad drug that's on the street. Now we're talking about heroin as the really bad drug on the street. Why are they using heroin?
Well, the short answer is economics, supply and demand. Heroin's cheap right now, and so that's what they're going to. We have a lot of pill addicts in Kentucky and West Virginia and Southern Ohio. And so all of these people who are addicted to pills had their pills taken away basically when we closed pill mills and the House built one. So heroin's so much cheaper now than opioid pills.
But heroin was the really bad stuff. When I was a kid, that was, if you smoked a little marijuana, the really bad thing was, you're going to go up to the next drugs, it's going to be LSD and heroin, you're going to die. So why isn't there that stigma, or do you have any idea why there's not that stigma now about heroin?
Part of it is it is common. It's so much more common, and people are moving toward heroin, and when all your buddies are doing it, it's not, it's not stigmatized quite as much. But yeah, it's weird to see it. I mean, it's just as bad a drug as it ever was. It's mostly because people are already addicted. I forget the percent. We've been writing some new articles about this, but something like 80% of heroin addicts used pills first, whereas only 10% of people who use pills go on to use heroin. So it's not everybody, but most of the people who come in that are addicted to heroin started with pills, and when the pills ran out, they're addicted. They can think of nothing else but to get high again, and that's why they turn to it.
And that's their gateway drug, I guess.
Yeah,
the pills are.
Oh, definitely. There's a lot written in the medical literature, and even a great book called Dreamland that was all about how we were undertreating pain in the 90s. Everyone wanted to prescribe opioids. We thought they were safe. They're not addictive. That was even thrown out there, and we know now that they are. But so many people were treated with opioids for non-cancer pain, and they all just couldn't help. I mean, they just got addicted. There's no way around it, and now,
here they are. If I could make you ruler of the world with all the money in the world, what would you do to solve this problem as an ER doctor?
Oh, shoot, yeah, I don't know the answer to that question. I'm not a huge fan of maintenance therapy where you substitute instead of, you use methadone or any of these other drugs that can help wean them off heroin, but then they still take this drug indefinitely. So I'm not a huge fan of that. There is a lot of evidence that criminalizing is a negative way to handle it, that all you do is give people a record, they're in prison, and it doesn't really help the addiction. So treating heroin addiction as a medical problem and not a criminal problem.
Right.
So I'd devote most of the money, if you gave me this unlimited budget, I'd devote it to detox treatment, legislation like what we were passing, take pills off the street, stop creating opioid addicts. I'd try to treat it that way instead of giving it to DEA and ATF and
I got you.
That
the
route.
Government. Yeah. Okay. Dr. Martin Hecker, appreciate you being on. Thanks for being on the show.
Thank
Good
you.
luck in the emergency room.
Thank you.
All right. That was Dr. Martin Hecker from the University of Louisville Physicians, and he's also the research director in the Department of Emergency Medicine at the University of Louisville. So let's wrap up the show here with a little bit of trivia about U of L. Did you know in 1927, U of L assumed responsibility for medical service at what was then City Hospital? A decade later, during the Great Flood of 1937, the facility, now University of Louisville Hospital, was surrounded by water but had electricity and continued to operate, admitting more than 1,700 patients in 3 days during that flood of 1927. Big deal for the University of Louisville at the time. You can catch U of L Today with Mark Hebert on 93.9 The Ville every Monday and Tuesday at 6, and also on the weekends on Saturday and Sunday. You can also hear and see me on WHAS TV every Monday morning around 9:30 or so on Great Day Live with another interesting story about something going on at the University of Louisville. So thank you all for listening, and go Cards.